In 2012, a young Malaysian financier named Jho Low walked into the New York office of Goldman Sachs and proposed a bond deal. The bond was to be issued by a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund called One Malaysia Development Berhad, known by its initials 1MDB. The fund had been founded 3 years earlier with the personal endorsement of the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak. Its purpose, on paper, was to invest in long-term strategic infrastructure for the development of Malaysia. The bond Goldman Sachs ultimately arranged for 1MDB raised $1,750 million United States dollars in March 2012. Two more bond issuances followed in May and in March of 2013, raising a further $4,750 million. The total raised by Goldman for 1MDB across the three bonds was $6,500 million. Goldman's fees for arranging these deals were $600 million. The funds were ostensibly directed toward power station acquisitions and energy infrastructure. The funds were not directed toward power station acquisitions. The funds were diverted, over a period of approximately 6 years, into a network of offshore shell companies, private bank accounts in Switzerland and Singapore, and personal expenditures by a small group of individuals. Among them Jho Low, Prime Minister Najib Razak, Najib's stepson Riza Aziz, and a series of Goldman Sachs bankers, including the Southeast Asia chairman Tim Leissner. So, the United States Department of Justice in 2016 would call it the largest kleptocracy case in their history. The estimated total stolen was $4.5 billion. The fund itself was left with debts of $7.8 billion. What happened to the money is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of grand corruption in modern history. It bought yachts. It bought paintings. It bought Beverly Hills mansions. It bought a Hollywood production company that, in 2013, produced a film called The Wolf of Wall Street. A film, in other words, about a stockbroker who steals from his clients to finance an extravagant lifestyle, was financed with money stolen from a sovereign wealth fund to finance an extravagant lifestyle. The man who introduced the production company to the underlying funds was thanked by name in the closing credits. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand who Jho Low was in 2009. Low Taik Jho, then in his late 20s, was the son of a wealthy Malaysian businessman of Chinese descent. He had been educated at Harrow and at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. At Wharton, he had befriended, among others, Riza Aziz, the stepson of the man who would become Malaysian Prime Minister later that year. By 2009, Jho Low had positioned himself as an intermediary between Najib Razak, on the one hand, and a number of Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds on the other. He had no official title in the Malaysian government. He had no formal banking qualifications. He was, in the language of the financial industry, an unaffiliated dealmaker. In July 2009, the Malaysian government formally established One Malaysia Development Berhad. Its founding capital was a single loan from the Malaysian Central Treasury. Within months, the fund had entered into a joint venture with a Saudi Arabian company called Petro Saudi International, ostensibly to develop oil and gas assets. Of the $700 million committed by the Malaysian side of that joint venture, the United States Department of Justice would later allege that approximately $700 million was diverted, almost in its entirety, to a shell company controlled by Jho Low. The pattern that began in 2009 continued. A deal was announced. Funds were transferred. The funds were rerouted. A second deal was announced, using the first as collateral. The proceeds of the second deal repaid the first, with enough left over for the participants to keep. By 2012, when Goldman Sachs entered the picture, the architecture was already mature. The Goldman bonds were not the beginning of the fraud. They were the mechanism that allowed it to scale. The Goldman deals deserve attention in their own right. Tim Leissner, the bank's Southeast Asia chairman, was the relationship manager. He had met Jho Low in 2009. By 2012, he was, in effect, the conduit between the bank and the fund. The bonds were structured as private placements. They were not offered publicly. They were sold, in their entirety, to a small group of institutional clients in the Middle East, who were paid a guaranteed return that was substantially above the prevailing market rate. Goldman's fees, $600 million across the three deals, were extraordinary. For a bond issuance of this size, fees of 1 to 2% would have been normal. Goldman charged just under 10%. Internal Goldman memos, later released as part of the bank's own settlement, indicated that compliance officers had raised concerns. The concerns were overridden. The deals were approved. Tim Leissner in 2018 would plead guilty to conspiracy, to launder money, and to violate the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He would be sentenced to 2 years in prison and to forfeit $43 million. Goldman Sachs, as an institution, would, in July 2020, pay a settlement of just under $3 billion. At the time, the largest single corporate settlement in the bank's history. The money, once it left 1MDB, went almost everywhere. The Department of Justice's civil forfeiture filings, made beginning in 2016, ran to several thousand pages, and the inventory of assets they identified is illustrative of what stolen public money looks like at scale. A $250 million yacht named Equanimity, registered in the Cayman Islands, a Bombardier private jet, a penthouse on the Upper West Side of Manhattan worth $51 million, a mansion in Beverly Hills, 15 rooms, owned through a chain of shell companies, paintings by Basquiat, by Picasso, by Monet, by Van Gogh, 12,000 pieces of jewelry, a diamond necklace valued at $27 million given by Jho Low to the Australian model Miranda Kerr, $300 million in cash and luxury goods seized from Najib Razak's personal residences in Kuala Lumpur in the May 2018 police raid that followed his electoral defeat. The Malaysian government described the seizure at the time as the largest in the country's history. And embedded in the middle of all of this was a Hollywood production company called Red Granite Pictures, co-founded by Najib's stepson Riza Aziz. Red Granite was financed. The Department of Justice would establish with approximately $155 million in funds that originated at 1MDB. The company's first major production, released in late 2013, was The Wolf of Wall Street. Jho Low attended the premieres. He was a regular figure at film industry events. He had been photographed with Leonardo DiCaprio, with Robert De Niro, with Jamie Foxx, with Paris Hilton, with Alicia Keys. He gave a $5 million birthday party for himself in Las Vegas in 2012, attended by, among others, Britney Spears, who performed. He paid for it, the Department of Justice would later allege, with money taken from a fund that was supposed to build power stations in Malaysia. The first public exposure came in July 2015. The Wall Street Journal, in a series of articles based on leaked documents from the Malaysian government's own anti-corruption commission, reported that approximately $700 million had been deposited into the personal bank accounts of Prime Minister Najib Razak in the weeks leading up to the May 2013 Malaysian general election. The Malaysian government's initial response was that the money was a personal donation from an unnamed member of the Saudi royal family. The investigators who had supplied the documents to the Wall Street Journal were dismissed. The country's attorney general was replaced. The deputy prime minister, who had publicly questioned the official explanation, was removed from office. For 3 years, the official Malaysian position was that no money had been stolen, that the funds were lawfully held, and that the foreign investigations being conducted by the United States, by Switzerland, by Singapore, and by half a dozen other jurisdictions were politically motivated. The position held in public until the 9th of May 2018. On that day, the Malaysian opposition coalition won a general election. Mahathir Mohamad, a former prime minister, returned to office at the age of 92. Najib Razak was barred from leaving the country within 48 hours. What followed was, in the modern history of grand kleptocracy prosecutions, almost unique. The new Malaysian government formally reopened every investigation that the previous one had closed. They permitted the United States and other jurisdictions to take possession of physical assets: yachts in Indonesian waters, mansions in California, paintings in Swiss free ports. The yacht Equanimity was sold in 2018 for $126 million. The Beverly Hills mansion was sold. The Manhattan penthouse was sold. The paintings were auctioned. By 2021, the United States Department of Justice had recovered and returned to the Malaysian government $1.2 billion. By 2022, the total recovered, across jurisdictions, exceeded $3.5 billion. Najib Razak himself was tried in Kuala Lumpur in 2020 on a first batch of charges relating to a subsidiary fund called SRC International. He was convicted on all 7 counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, plus a fine of 210 million ringgit. His appeal was rejected by the Malaysian Federal Court in August 2022. He began serving his sentence the same day. A second trial, concluded in December 2025, found him guilty of 25 further counts related to the diversion of approximately $1 billion from 1MDB itself. He was sentenced to a further 15 years. Jho Low has not been seen in public, in a verified location, since the second half of 2017. He is believed by Western intelligence agencies to be living in China. He has been charged by the United States, by Malaysia, and by Singapore. He has been convicted in absentia by a court in Kuwait. He has forfeited, through cooperating asset seizures, more than $700 million of his personal holdings. He has not been apprehended. The thing that distinguishes 1MDB from the long history of looting of national treasuries by political elites is not its size. $5 billion is far from the largest sum ever stolen by a head of government. It is the breadth of the international financial system that participated. Goldman Sachs, Falcon Private Bank in Switzerland, Banca Commerciale Lugano, the Royal Bank of Scotland Coutts in Singapore, Standard Chartered, Edmund de Rothschild, JP Morgan. Every one of these institutions had compliance policies. Every one of them had written procedures for the identification of politically exposed persons. Every one of them processed transactions, repeatedly and over a period of years, that those procedures should have stopped. The reason they did not stop is not primarily that the individual compliance officers were corrupt. The reason is that there was, in every institution, a relationship banker whose performance was measured in fees generated, and there was, in every institution, a compliance team whose objections could be overridden by senior management. And there was, in every institution, a tacit understanding that the consequences of refusing a major client's transaction were larger than the consequences of approving it. Until they were not. The fines levied against the banks involved in 1MDB by 2022 totaled approximately $7 billion. The fees the banks earned across the same period totaled approximately $1.5 billion. The arithmetic does not work in the bank's favor if you assume the fines will, in fact, be levied. Whether they will be levied next time, when the next Jho Low walks into the next Goldman Sachs office, with the next Najib Razak's letter of endorsement, depends on whether the people in the room remember what happened to Tim Leissner. Next file from the Capital Files, the 1890 nickel corner. The morning a French banker named Henri Secretan tried to corner the global nickel market with 500,000 pounds of borrowed credit, and the 72 hours that followed.